shows the children of Israel, he did not only move with Israel on religious grounds only, but he was everything to the children of Israel. So the Lord mixed politics with religion when he was moving with the children of Israel. And in theology we call it religio politico, where God moved the children of Israel as if Israel was the only nation in this world, and God gave them rules and regulations, what we call today the constitutions. God was the minister for agri for them. He was the minister for interior for them. From the Old Testament, you will read everything about governance when God was working with the children of Israel. David was not a lawgiver under the Old Testament. He was a king. The kings were there and the priests were there. The king's place is the palace and the priest's place is the sanctuary. And therefore, David is not claiming anything here that will warrant the understanding that David is asking we Christians today to use instrumental music. He's never done that. What did he do? He did what was right at his time. During his time, we call it the Mosaical dispensation. Ever since God created his world, there has been 3 major dispensations. The first dispensation is what is referred to as the patriarchal dispensation or the patriarchal age. When we say patriarchal, we're talking about of the fathers, where primarily God was using heads of families to rule in the affairs of men. After the patriarchal dispensation, which lasted for over 1800 years, God chose Moses to become the mediator between himself and the children of Israel. And that brought about what we also know as the Jewish dispensation or the Mosaical dispensation or the Mosaical age. Let us remember that patriarchal dispensation is not the same as Mosaical dispensation. There are laws and regulations that God gave to the people who lived under the patriarchal dispensation that were not necessarily given to those who lived under the Mosaical dispensation. The last but not the least of the dispensations is the dispensation we live in today, which is the Christian dispensation. Amen. When one claims to be a Christian, he essentially is saying that he belongs to the Christian dispensation. David the king lived 1,000 years before the birth of Christ. David never knew of Christianity. Somehow, being a prophet, God revealed a lot of things to them, but they didn't know what actually was going to happen. He lived 1,000 years before the Lord Jesus was even born. And therefore, in our Bible studies, we need to understand that there is a difference between the system of worship under the Mosaical dispensation and that of the New Testament. These are not the same. If you confuse yourself and you want to mix the two together, you get yourself into trouble in biblical studies. Because under the Mosaical dispensation, the Lord required from the children of Israel to offer burnt offerings to him. Why don't we do that today? And if I do not offer burnt offering today to God, am I disobeying? No, I am not disobeying because God has not even given me a law. Now, how can I disobey a law that has not yet been given? So the children of Israel offered burnt offerings to God. And they did not do that because they wanted to do that. They did that because God asked them to do that. And we are saying that today, we must do those things that the Lord is asking us to do as Christians. Amen. Christian dispensation is different from the Mosaical dispensation. And the Mosaical dispensation is independent of the Patriarchal dispensation. Each dispensation had its own laws and regulations given to them by Jehovah God. And therefore, when we talk about acceptable worship in singing today, we are talking about the acceptable singing that the New Testament allows us to use. Amen. Now, if you have some problems with this, there are some interesting Bible passages that I would like you to examine. One of them is Hebrews chapter 8 and verse number 7. Bringing a clear distinction between the Mosaical age and then the Christian age. The book of Hebrews, chapter number 8 and verse number 7. The Holy Spirit says, "For if that first covenant had been faultless, then no place would have been sought for a second." Let me repeat that. For if that first covenant had been faultless, then no place would have been sought for a second. And of course, the first covenant had to do with the covenant that Jehovah God had with the children of Israel. And don't forget, David lived under that covenant. And the Bible is saying, if that covenant had been faultless, if there was no fault with that covenant, there wouldn't have been the need, the necessity of we having the new covenant today. And therefore, when you are talking things that pertains to Christianity, one should be careful how you go to the Old Testament to pick and choose some things and try to bind them on Christians. Unless that is what the Bible is saying, you cannot go to the Old Testament, quote some passages, and enforce them on Christians. Because there are so many things that happened under the Old Testament that we are not under any obligation to follow them. So it is important for us to get to know this when we are having our private Bible studies, public Bible studies, and especially when we are helping people to become Christians. Let us draw that scriptural distinction between the two covenants. These are the two major covenants. We are not saying there were only two covenants or there are only two covenants in the Bible. But the two major covenants that are found in the Bible has to do with the laws of Moses and then what we term as the laws of Christ. Christianity is different from Judaism. In Galatians chapter 1 and verse number 13, Paul, the greatest apostle of all times, wrote, "For you have heard of my former conduct in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God beyond measure and tried to destroy it." Paul now draws the distinction between Judaism and Christianity. He used to be in Judaism, and now he reminds the brethren in Galatia, "You have heard of my former conduct in Judaism, how out of Judaism I persecuted the church of God without measure, and I even tried to destroy the church." The church age is different from the Mosaical age. And Paul tells us we have heard of his former conduct. In Hebrews chapter 10 and verse number 9, Hebrews 10 and verse number 9, the writer of the book of Hebrews draws our attention to another fact about the difference between the old covenant and then the new covenant. And he said, "Behold, I have come to do your will, O God." He takes away the first that he may establish the second. Hallelujah. Amen. He takes away the first that he may establish the second. Question: who gave the first? God did. Who took it away? God did. Who established the second? God. And people grossly misunderstand this basic principle of understanding the Holy Scriptures, and we fight over words and so many things, especially when we meet our friend from the Adventist church. Our charismatic friends are so confused because they will pick something from the Old Testament and pick another from the New Testament, and if it is convenient, they say, "Oh, it works." If it is inconvenient, they say, "Oh, no, it doesn't work." You cannot do that to Bible study. So there is something called the first covenant in the Bible, and there is something called the second covenant. And the Holy Scripture is saying that for the second covenant to be effective, God had to take away the first. This is not a suggestion from me or from anybody. This is what the Holy Scriptures is saying. What then am I saying? I'm saying that the passages we read from the Old Testament regarding instrumental music do not apply to Christians, just as burnt offerings do not apply to us today. Apart from the two that we have mentioned, there are so many things in the Old Testament that God gave to the children of Israel that are inapplicable to Christians today. Amen. In your Bible, you can mark Leviticus chapter 19 and verse number 19, where you will see three things that God so seriously gave to the children of Israel, and we dare say these do not apply to us. So many of them. Leviticus 19 and verse number 19. From God to the children of Israel. "You shall keep my statutes. You shall not let your livestock breed with another kind." That is a law. So people talk about the 10 commandments, say that the commandments were more than 10. The laws were more than 10. Because this one is not found in the Decalogue. But God reminded the children of Israel, "Keep my statutes. You shall not let your livestock breed with another kind. You shall not sow your field with mixed seed." That is law number 2 in this verse. Number 3, "Nor shall a garment of mixed linen and wool come upon you." Now, if you are doing Bible studies, go back and read this thing one more time. There are 3 things in there. And all of these are coming from Jehovah God to the children of Israel. Don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. If God says don't do it, you sin. And what did we read about? First of all, he said, "You shall not let your livestock breed with another kind." Now think about that. Those of us from Africa, if you have goats, be careful not to allow the sheep to get into the pen of their goats. They should not breed with another kind. This law was as important as the 10 Commandments because it came from God. And we are saying that, don't worry, this is not given to the Christian. God gave these to the children of Israel. If you want to have an argument and you want to obey that, kudos to you. Go ahead and do it. And I'll give you some more. if you want to do that. But the truth of the matter is, this was not given to us. Number 2, you shall not sow your field with mixed seed. So those of us from Liberia, from Ghana, from West Africa, when we talk farm, we are talking about the plantain, the cassava, the tomatoes, and everything together on that piece of land. And God gave a law to the children of Israel: do not do that. Last but not the least, talks about clothing. Nor shall a garment of mixed linen and wool come upon you. Makes me guilty tonight. This is different, this is different, and this is different. So God was telling the children of Israel, do not do that. And we are saying, this is not talking to Christians. This fell under the Mosaic period. And God did that for a purpose. If you understand this, why don't you understand instrumental music? And if you want to go instrumental music, why don't you obey this? If not, why not? So in the Holy Scriptures, there is something called the Old Covenant and then the New Covenant. He took away the first, that he may establish the second. And when you continue, he said, God had desire in this. Desire in what? In changing from the first covenant onto the second. We are not saying the first covenant was bad. We don't use that word. God gave it, so it wasn't bad. But now we want you to think about good, better, best. If the Old Testament was good, the New Testament is better. Amen. And that is the message you get from the book of Hebrews. Better, 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 better. Moses was not bad. He was a mediator between God and the children of Israel. He wasn't a bad servant. In fact, the book of Hebrews tells you he was an obedient servant of God. So Moses was not bad. But Jesus came and he became the mediator between humans and Jehovah God. And that makes him a better mediator. So we are not saying Moses was bad. But we are saying where there is good, there is better. And the Bible tells us from 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 5 and 6. 2 Corinthians chapter number 3, verse 5 and 6. And it reads, not that we are sufficient of ourselves to think of anything as being from ourselves, but our sufficiency is from God. When you become a Christian, you cannot claim to be 100% righteous. We are all here by the grace of God. We are here because God, in his wisdom, chose to forgive us. We are all here because of the mercies that are bestowed upon us. We didn't do anything to get our salvation. You cannot earn salvation because you cannot work to get there. Human beings are so fragile. We are right today and tomorrow we are wrong. That is the difference between man and God. God is consistently righteous. We are not. There is a but in each and every one of us, even those of us who preach. He does this and that and that and that, and then the wife will tell you, you don't know it yet. You don't know when he comes to church, the way he preaches, you don't know. And yes, you don't know and you don't want to know. None of us is so righteous, and so Paul over here is saying that we are not saying, we are not claiming perfection. We are not saying that we are the best amongst the Lords. Our sufficiency did not come from us, but our sufficiency came from God himself. And look up at verse number 6, 2 Corinthians 3 and verse number 6. And he continues by saying, who also made us sufficient as ministers of the new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. We have the Old Testament and we have the New Testament, otherwise called the Old Covenant or the New Covenant. And Paul is saying that when one claims to be a Christian, he or she has become a servant of the New Covenant. Is he wrong or right? He is right because he wrote under inspiration. Christians are under the New Covenant because if that first covenant had been faultless, there wouldn't have been a place for a second one. And therefore, if we want to worship God in spirit and in truth, if we want our singing to be acceptable to God under the Christian dispensation, you go to the New Testament. And they continue steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine. Christianity is ordered after a definite pattern. Christianity is ordered after a definite pattern. And I love definite and I love pattern. Definite pattern. You cannot come to God and give him suggestions. You don't go to church and say, Lord, I feel like. No, you don't come here to do things you feel like doing. But we go to church to obey. We want to obey our God. We don't go to church to obey human beings. We want to obey our God. And that is why we keep on searching the scriptures to find out what is it that the Lord is asking us to do. What is it that he's asking us not to do? That is what Christianity is all about. Trust and obey. For there's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey. That is what it is all about. Trusting God and striving to obey him. It brings you inner peace. It brings you happiness. It brings you joy. It brings you tranquility within your soul. Because you have the right type of relationship with your God, your Maker, the one who brought you into this world. You are right with him, trusting God and obeying him. So we are not being dogmatic, churches of Christ. We want to study the Bible. We want to find out what God is expecting from us. And since singing is an integral part of worship, we want to explore the scriptures to find out what God wants as we go to church. I don't go to church and dance and make merry and be happy and interpret that to be God is also happy. No. God tells us what he likes in his word. That is why he's given us 66 independent books. Genesis to Revelations, you have a complete library. 66 books. Some of the time people think that the Bible is just like a newspaper. It is not. If you're a man in the Church of Christ and you haven't been trained formally, they give you an appointment on this Sunday and they ask you to preach. You'll be excited. You'll do it the first Sunday. And woe betides the elders or the preacher to call you again the following week and say, you are going to preach again. Genesis to Revelation, you will not find a passage. You will not be able to see it. The Bible is so big. It contains the mind of God. And he encourages us to study it. And he encourages us to rightly divide this word of truth. And as I told you earlier on, there is no dramatization made here. You don't need to dramatize anything. That is why I want to sound as natural as possible in this. Jumping from here to here and voicing everything out, making all the noise doesn't mean you are worshiping. It doesn't mean so. That is just an emotion. And people go to church, and out of emotions they do a lot of stuff. And you get to the Holy Scriptures, and the Bible says no. And yesterday he told us, people go to church, and after the church service, God marks them 0. In vain, they worship me. We don't want to worship our God in vain. We want to worship him meaningfully. We want to worship him with our understanding of his word. We want to sing at church, but we want to do it the way he wants us to do it. Amen. And the Bible says, he has made us the servants of the new covenant. The New Testament talks about singing. The New Testament talks about singing, not merely music. Music is so vast. There are 2 natural divisions when it comes to music. Instrumental music and a cappella or vocal. So even those who read music as a course, even to the universities, when we ask you to make music, it's different from asking you to sing. Amen. Make music is different from sing.